Hey everyone, in this video, you'll learn how to use the FS inventory system to set up a fully functional inventory for your game. We'll start by creating items from scratch using the inventory editor window. You'll learn how to equip items like weapons, armor, and how to customize the inventory to match your game's style. We'll also cover how to set up merchants to buy, sell, craft, and dismantle items. We'll add item pickups and look at how to save and load the inventory data. We'll also learn how to use item actions and create custom ones to integrate the inventory system with any custom controller. Finally, we'll integrate the inventory system with the FS melee combat system, allowing the player to use different weapons and armor in combat. So let's get started. So here I have a project with the inventory system asset installed. So let's look at how to set up the inventory system. So there are two ways to set up. If you want to use the inventory system with our controller, then you can set it up from the FS systems window. So from here, you just have to select both inventory and locomotion system and click on the setup button. Okay, so this will create a player with an inventory attached to it. All right, so we can try playing it, and if we press the I key on keyboard, it should open up the inventory. All right, we don't have any items in the inventory yet, but the setup is working, right? So this is how we set up the inventory if you want to use it with our controller. And if you want to use it with another controller, you can do it from the inventory editor window. So here, from the setup tab, you just have to drag and drop your player game object and set up the inventory. All right. So just to demonstrate this, what I'll do is I'll just delete the controller that we created, and then I'll create a controller with just the locomotion, and then we'll look at how to add inventory to that controller. All right. So this controller just has locomotion. It doesn't have inventory. And now let's add the inventory to it. So I'll open up the inventory editor, and in the setup tab, I'll drag and drop the player game object and then click on setup inventory system. All right. So this is how you set up the inventory system with other controllers. Okay. So again, we can try testing the game. Okay. So yeah, you can see that it is working. But right now we don't have any items in the inventory, and we haven't set up any category slots in the inventory. So you can do that by selecting the player and going to the inventory script. And from here you can add default items, category slots and all that. So by default, the asset comes with some demo items. So you can view and manage all the items from the inventory editor. So this editor is one of the most powerful feature of this inventory system. You can manage category, item, equipment slots, currency, and all that from a single window. All right. So here we have some default categories and some default items. But for this tutorial, I don't want to use these default items because I want to show you how to create items from scratch. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete these demo items folder. It's a folder that contains all the demo items and categories that comes with the asset. So I'll just delete this folder. So now if you close and open the inventory editor again, you can see that we don't have any items here, but in the category we do have two default categories that we use internally. And if you have other modules like melee combat system installed, then you'll have more default categories. But I want to show you how to create categories and items from scratch. So let's say we want to create some weapons for our player, like sword, axe, and all that. So for that, first we have to create a category called weapon, and then create a sword and axe item under the weapon category. All right, so let's look at how to do that. So from the category tab, I'll click on this plus button to add a new category. and I'll just call this weapon. Okay. So the category is a scriptable object, so we have to save it onto a folder. So I'll create a new folder here called resources, and I'll save our weapon category inside this folder. Okay. So the reason why I save it under a folder called resources is because it'll allow me to save and load this category if I want. So we have created a category called weapon. So you can change its name from here, and you can give it a description, and you can also give an icon for it if you want. I'll just leave those empty for now. And then we have item properties. These are really important. So we can define properties for a category, and all the items under that category will have those properties. Okay. So for example, we want all our weapons to be equipable, right? So we can define it here in the weapon category, and all the items that come under that category will be equipable. Okay. So let's look at all the item properties one by one. Stackable indicates if we can have multiple items in a slot. Okay. So if you look at this example, here I have 5 potions. So that is because this potion is a stackable item. But if I look at the weapons, it doesn't show a count on it. That's because it's not a stackable item. So I don't want to turn on stackable for weapon. So next we have another checkbox called equipable. So this determines if an item can be equipped to an equipment slot. Alright, so equipment slots are these slots that you see over here. If an item is equipable, you'll be able to drag and drop different items to these equipment slots. Okay, so we have few equipment slots by default, but you can also easily add new equipment slots from here. Alright, now back in our weapon category, when we make a category equipable, we can assign a default equipment slot. So for weapon, I'll assign the slot as melee weapon. Okay, so next we have another checkbox called consumable. So this indicates if an item can be consumed from the inventory. So items like potions, food, and all that can be consumed. But for weapon, we don't want that. So up next we have options for sellable and droppable. So these will allow you to sell and drop items in that category. So if you have some special items that should not be dropped or sold, you can turn this off. Alright. So up next we have attributes. So just like item properties, we can define attributes for our category, and all the items under this category will have those attributes. Alright. So for weapon, let's say we want an attribute like damage, which indicates the base damage of attacks performed by a weapon. So you can add multiple attributes if you want. Attributes can either be an integer, decimal, or text. Okay, so here for weapon, I just need a single attribute called damage, and we can make it an integer. So yeah, we have defined our weapon category. So now let's try creating an item under the weapon category. So let's say I want to create something like a sword. So I'll just create an item called rusty sword. Alright, and just like the category, we have to save it as a file to a folder. So I'll save it under the resources folder. Alright, so this created an item called rusty sword, and from here we can set its category. So its category should be weapon. Alright, and as soon as I changed the category, you can see that we have the damage under the attributes, right? So this damage was defined from here, and we have it under the attributes, and we can set a value for it from here. Alright, so we'll get back to it. Let's look at each field of the item one by one. So in the general properties, we have name, category, description, icon, and weight. So I'll just leave the description empty for now, and let me actually set an icon. I'll just search for sword and I'll set this icon. And next we have weight. So in this inventory system, you can add a weight limit to the items the player can carry. Okay, it's a pretty common feature in inventory of games like Witcher, Skyrim, and all that. So you can give a weight to each item, and the inventory will have a total weight limit. So I'll just set the weight of the sword as something like 5. And next we have equipment properties. So since this item is equipable, we'll have this equipment properties over here. And the equipment slot of a sword will be melee weapon. And from here, we could also attach a model when this item is equipped. So we'll look at this later. First, let's set up the item. So next we can set the price of the item. So here you can set price and a currency. So you can add and edit currencies from the currency tab. So this will be useful in games where you have multiple currencies. Alright. So up next we have attributes. So here for the damage, I'll just give a value like 7. Okay. So this will be the base damage of a sword weapon. Alright. So up next we have crafting, item actions and all that. So we'll be looking at those later. First, let's create some basic weapons and set those up in our inventory. Alright, so this is all we have to do for our sword. We gave it a weight, a price, and a damage attribute. So let's add another weapon. So let's say I want to add an axe. I'll just name this something like an old axe. And again, let me store it inside my resources folder. So first we have to assign its category. So I'll make its category weapon. And next I'll give it an icon. I'll just choose this. And then for the weight, I'll give something like 10. An axe should be heavier than a sword, right? So sword is 5 and axe is 10. And the equipment slot will be melee weapon itself. And then for the price, we can set it to something like 15. The sword is 10 and axe is 15. And then for the damage, I'll give something like 10, slightly more than the sword. Okay, so now we have 2 weapons. So let's try adding these to our inventory. So I'll select the player and I'll find the inventory script. And in here, first we have to define category slots. Okay, so in inventory, items can be organized into different category slots. Okay, so in a category slot, we can have a single category like a weapon, or we can have multiple categories. So for example, you can add weapon, armor, and all that as a single category slot if you want to show them together. Okay, in that case, you just have to enable the multiple categories and you'll be able to add as many categories as you want to this category slot. We'll look at it later. For now, let's just test with our weapon category. And next we can give it some default items so that it will be there in the inventory when we start the game. So first I'll add a sword and then I'll just add the axe. Okay, so now when we start the game, we should have these items in the inventory. So let's test that. Okay, so if I press I, you can see that in the inventory, we have a category slot called weapon and we have 2 items. Alright, we can hover on these items to see its details and we can also select different items by clicking on them or using the navigation keys from keyboard or joystick. For joystick, you will have to set up the inputs because it's not set up by default. We'll be looking at that later, but first let's complete the setup of the inventory. So yeah, we have 2 items and we'll also be able to equip these items to our equipment slot. So if I drag and drop the sword into my melee weapon slot, you can see that the item is equipped. Okay, And I can also drag it out of the equipment slot to unequip it. Alright. And now if I hover over the axe, you can see a +3 after the damage of the axe. So that is because the damage of sword is 7 and axe is 10. So this indicates that the axe has better damage. So you'll be able to compare attributes like this if an item belongs to the same equipment slot. Alright, so we can also equip the axe by dragging it onto the melee slot. And now if you hover on the sword, you can see -3 over here because its damage is lower. It's a pretty common feature in most inventory systems, so I believe you're familiar with that. And by the way, you can also equip and unequip weapons by using the E key. Alright, when I press E key, it'll automatically equip. And you can consume an item by using the C key, but weapons are not consumable. So we look at those when we create potions. And you can also drop a weapon by using the R key. Alright, it'll ask for a warning, and if you press yes, the weapon will be dropped from the inventory. Okay, and by the way, you can change the input of all these actions from the inventory input manager. So you can just directly define the keys, or you can even use the new input system. I'll show you how to do that in the later part of this video. So now we have created 2 weapons. So up next, let's create some armor items. So we have a category called armor by default. It's just a simple category with a defense attribute, and it is equipable with default slot set to body, but this can be different for different items. Okay, so here I'm not going to create a different category for the armor. I'll just use this default one. And if you're using this inventory system with our controller, then we'll automatically reduce the damage inflicted to the characters if they are wearing an item in this category. Alright, that's why we have this as a default category. So let's create few armor items. So first I'll create a breastplate. Okay, and its category will be armor, and I'll give it an icon. And let me set its weight to something like 10, and its equipment slot will be body. And for the price, let me give something like 40. And for the defense attribute, I'll just give 5. Okay, so yeah, these are all the things that we need to define. And next I'll create another armor item, and this one will be a helmet. Alright, again I'll set the category to armor. I'll give it an icon. Alright, so here the equipment slot will be head because the helmet should be equipped to the head. Right, for the price I'll give something like 20, and for the defense I'll give something like 2. Alright, so next let's add these items to our inventory. So here we can either add this to a separate category slot, or we can combine the weapon and armor into a single slot. So let's actually combine them. So we have to enable multiple categories, and here we have to give this category slot a name. So I'll just call this something like melee items, since it can have both melee weapons and melee armor. Okay, so let me give armor as the second category, and in the default items I'll just add these 2 items. Okay, and now let's try testing it. Alright, so now we have these 2 items also in the inventory. We can also try equipping them. So the armor should be equipped to the body, and the helmet should be equipped to the head. Alright, if I try to equip them to some other slot, you can see that it will not work. Okay, So up next, let's create some potions. So I'll open up the inventory editor, and first we need to create a category for potions. So from here, I'll create a new category called potion. All right. And the potion will be stackable and consumable because we should be able to consume the potion, right? And then we can even make the potion equipable. In most games, we have consumable slots in which we can equip consumable items, which can then be used easily while you're playing the game without going to the inventory, right? So let's make potions equipable, and I'll set its equipment slot as consumable. Okay, and let's give it an attribute called heal amount, and you can even add other attributes like heal time if you want the healing to happen over a time and not instantly. And for potions, we'll be creating a custom action. So actions can be used to specify what should happen when a potion is consumed, right? So we'll be looking at actions later. For now, let's just create some potion items under the potion category. So from here, I'll create a new item called normal potion. Okay, and I'll change its category to potion. I'll give it an icon, and its equipment slot will be consumable slot. I'll just give it a price of 20, and I'll set its heal amount to something like 30. So it will heal the HP by 30. And let's keep the heal time at 0 for now, which means the potion will heal the player instantly. Alright, so next let's also create another potion. I'll just call this something like super potion. It'll have better healing abilities. Alright, again I'll set the category to potion. I'll give it an icon. Okay, and by the way, I forgot to set the weight of the normal potion. Let me set it to something like 1. And the super potion also can be 1. And I'll set the price to something like 40. And the heal amount to something like 50. And now let's go ahead and add the potions to our inventory. So we'll create a new category slot for the potions. And this can be a category slot with a single category. In future, if you have things like mana potions or potions that heal other attributes, you can combine them all into a single category slot. But for now, I'll just make it a single category slot. Okay, and I'll just add some potions as default items. So potion is a stackable item, so we can give a count more than 1. So I'll set the count to something like 5, and let me also add a super potion. I'll set its count to something like 2. Okay, so let's try testing this. Alright, so we don't see the potions here because it's in a different category slot. So we can change the category slots by pressing on these buttons. Alright, so now we can see the potions, and you can see that in each slot we can have multiple potions because potions are a stackable item. Okay, and potions are also consumable, so we can press C to consume the potion. So right now nothing happens when you consume the potion, but you can use item actions to execute custom code when an item is consumed. We'll be looking at that at later part of this video. And by the way, we should also be able to equip the potion into our consumable slot. All right. So that is working fine. So we have created a few items that we can equip into different slots. All right. But when we equip items like the breastplate and helmet and all that, it should be added to our player character, right? So let's do that next. So let me open up the inventory editor, and to attach a game object when equipping an item, we can use this attach model checkbox. All right, and in here we can provide the prefab to spawn when this item is equipped. Okay, and then we also have another checkbox called is skinned mesh. So what is skinned mesh? Skin mesh is a type of mesh that changes according to the bone of our character. All right. So when attaching things like a breastplate, we can't simply attach a normal game object to our character. So if I try to attach a game object like armor directly to a player, you can see that it does not change according to the bones of the character. Right. This should be attached to the arm, but it is not. And not just the arm, if I move any other bones of my character, you can see that the armor is not adjusted accordingly. Okay, so when attaching such objects, we can't attach them directly. We have to attach them as a skinned mesh. All right. So the skin mesh for a character will have a set of bones, and those bones will be the same bones of that of the character. Okay. So to test things like attaching armor, we can't use this character. Instead, we'll have to use some modular characters in which equipments comes as a skinned mesh. So I'm going to use the character from this asset called Modular Fantasy Knight character. It's a free asset. You can use any characters you want, or you can even model the skinned meshes on your own. But I'm just going to use the character from this pack. Okay, so let me just show you the character first. I'll just copy this skin to model. So this is like the base character, but we can attach equipments to it. So in the separated mesh folder, we have a lot of equipments. So we can attach things like armor, helmet, and all that. Okay, but we can't directly attach it like this. We have to attach it as a skinned mesh by mapping the bones of the skin mesh and the character. Okay, if we attach it directly, then it won't work. We can test it by rotating the spine. So yeah, you can see it won't work. So we have to attach it as a skinned mesh, and that can only be done programmatically because we have to map all the bones and all that. But the good news is this asset handles all that for you. So in the item editor, you just have to turn on this skinned mesh checkbox, and the model will automatically be attached as a skinned mesh by mapping all the bones and all that. Okay, so let me just assign this tunic game object for the armor, and I'll also assign the helmet. Okay, so now we can attach these objects to our default character since they have different set of bones. So we'll have to create a player character using the model that comes with the Fantasy Knight pack. Only then we'll be able to attach those objects to it. Okay, so first we have to make this a humanoid. Only then we'll be able to use it with our controller. And now I'll go ahead and create a player character with this model. So I just have to drag and drop the model here and click on setup, and that will create a player character with this model. Okay, and by the way, we can copy the values of the inventory from our old player character so that we don't have to fill all these things again. So I'll copy component and I'll paste its value to our new player character. Okay, So now let's try testing the game with this character, and the character is working fine. So now let me open the inventory, and we do have our default items in the inventory. And next let's try equipping the armor. Okay, and yeah, you can see that it has been equipped correctly on our player character, and it is moving properly with the bones. So that's good. Our skin mesh is attached correctly, and we can also try attaching the helmet. All right, and you can see that the helmet is also attached properly to the player. Okay, so we looked at how to attach skin meshes. So next, let's try attaching things like sword, axe, and all that. So we can just attach them to the back of the player, like we see in most games. So for items like weapons, we don't have to attach them as a skinned mesh because weapons should not change according to the bone, right? So we have to attach those as a normal mesh. So let's see how we can do that. So I'll open up the inventory editor and let's attach a model for the sword. So here I'll check the attached model checkbox, and for the sword we don't want it to be a skinned mesh, and when it's not a skinned mesh it won't be attached to any bone of the character. So we'll have to specify its position and rotation manually. Alright, so I have a sword model here and I want to attach this to the back of the player. So what we can do is we can find the bone of a player to which we can attach it. So spine 2 seems like a good bone because it's at the back of the player. And under this, I'll just create another empty object that will act as a holder for the weapon. So I'll call this melee weapon holder, and then I'll attach the sword to it. Okay, so let's place the sword so that it looks like it is attached to the back of the player. Alright, we'll have to view this sword while playing the game. We might need to leave extra spaces for clothes, armor, and all that. So let me try attaching the armor and see how it looks. So yeah, you can see we need to push it back a bit. So let me push it back and find the exact position we need. Okay, that looks fine. We can look at it from the game view. And yeah, that should be enough. So before we stop the game, we can copy the position and rotation. So first I'll copy the position and I'll paste it to our local position over here. And let me also copy the rotation and I'll paste it over here. Alright, so now I can stop the game, and we also have to assign this prefab over here, and now we can remove this game object. Alright, so how do we know that the sword should be spawned to the melee weapon holder? We can't directly assign it to the item because this is a game object in the scene and it cannot be assigned to a scriptable object. Okay, so instead what we can do is in the player we have a script called item attacher. Alright, and in here we can specify the holder for each equipment slot. Alright, so for the melee weapon it is the melee weapon holder, and if you have a ranged weapon, something like a gun or a arrow, then you can add a different slot for that too. Okay, so let's try testing this, and the sword should spawn on the back of the player when we equip it from the inventory. All right, so that is working fine. And by the way, if you're using the inventory system with our melee combat system, you can easily equip the sword to the player's hand and the player will perform the attacks for that sword. Okay, so by combining the inventory system with the melee combat system, you'll be able to create combat where the player can easily switch weapon from the inventory and each weapon will play different animations. So we'll look into integration with melee combat system later. So up next, let's look at what all settings you have in the inventory system. So these settings will allow you to customize the inventory based on the needs of your game. Okay, so in the inventory script, we have already looked at few things here. We have added default items and few default category slots, but there are a few more settings over here. From here, you can set the weight capacity. So by default, it's set to 50, but you can change it from here if you want. All right, and then there's a checkbox called overweight allowed. This indicates whether we can have items over the weight capacity. Most games allow you to have items above the weight capacity, but there'll be some sort of penalty to it. Okay, so for example, the player might not be able to run if the inventory is overweight. So you can tweak these based on the requirement for your game. And then there's a checkbox called has fixed number of slots. So this is turned off by default. And when this is turned off, the inventory slots will keep expanding when you add more and more items. Okay, you will be able to scroll the inventory like this, and this will allow you to add any number of items to the inventory. Okay, so if you look at a game like Witcher, it uses this kind of system. You can add as many items as you want, and it'll just keep scrolling down. Okay, but in the inventory of some games, you won't be able to do that. You'll have a fixed number of slots in the inventory. So, for example, you'll have like 30 slots, and you won't be able to store more items than that in the inventory. Okay, so if you turn this on, then the number of slots will be fixed. You can define the number of slots here. These slots will be spawned automatically, and the player will only be allowed to store that many number of items. Okay, so I'll just turn it off by default. So up next, let's look at how to customize the UI of the inventory. So while the storage of the inventory is defined in this inventory script, the UI is in the inventory canvas. Okay, I can just open up the inventory canvas and I can enable the inventory container. Okay, so by default, we won't be in this 2D mode. This is the view that you see by default, right? So if you want to see the canvas, you'll have to go to the 2D mode and then you can double click on the canvas and it'll zoom out and you'll be able to see the UI. Okay, so let's look at the inventory container. There is a header and a content and a footer. So inside the content, it's again separated into a left and right area. And in the left, you have inventory UI, and in the right, you have the equipment UI. Okay, so if you want to customize inventory UI, you can do it from here. All right, so right now in the inventory UI, we have 7 columns and 7 rows, right? So let's say you don't want 7 columns, you only want 5 or 6 columns. Then you can simply reduce the width of the inventory UI and it'll keep reducing the column. Okay, so let's say you want 6 columns, you can change that, and then again you can center it by holding Alt and changing the pivot to center. Okay, so now the inventory will have 6 columns, and we also have to change those things in the inventory UI. So open up the selection settings, and here we have to define the number of columns that we have. So now it will be 6 instead of 7. This is important because when you reach the last column in the inventory, and if you try to go right from there, then you'll automatically go to the equipment UI, right? So the inventory UI and the equipment UI are separate selection UIs, and They are linked together by using this linked selectors. Okay, so in the selection settings of the inventory UI, I have assigned the equipment UI as a linked selector and the direction to right. So when we reach the end of the inventory UI and press right, it will automatically go to the equipment UI. Okay, so we have to know the number of columns to be able to do that. And by the way, you can also change the number of rows by changing the height of the box if you want. And if you change it, you also have to update it over here. Okay, so I'll change 7 to 6. So we need the total rows so that we know from what point we have to start scrolling the inventory. Okay, and by the way, you can also have different number of rows and columns. So the number of rows can be 7 like before, and the columns can be 6 if you want that. And then we can also change the number of slots here. So earlier it was 7 multiplied by 7, 49, but now it's 7 multiplied by 6, right? 6 columns and 7 rows, so it should be 42. It doesn't matter even if it's 49, it's just that you'll see a scroll bar by default. Okay, so let's just try testing this. I'll just disable the inventory by default so that it doesn't appear before we open it from the game. Okay, and yeah, now we can see that we have 6 columns, and if we go beyond the 6th column, the selection will go to the equipments UI. Okay, so this is how you can change the inventory UI. So let me just undo and change it back to 7 columns because 6 columns doesn't look good. Okay, and by the way, you can change the entire UI of the inventory if you want. So you can go inside the inventory UI prefab, and from here you can change the UI based on what you want for your game. So for example, if your game is set in a sci-fi setting, then this inventory UI won't match for it. So in that case, you can go ahead and change the UI. So let's try doing that. So just to give you an example of how to customize the inventory UI, I'll use the UI from this pack and I'll customize our inventory UI to make it look like an inventory for a sci-fi game. Okay, so this is the pack. So we can try to replace the UI from this pack. So I'll go inside the inventory UI prefab, and from here, first I'll change the background. So in the sci-fi GUI asset, we do have lots of different UI elements. So I'll use this one for the background. Okay, so this background doesn't look good with our background image for the entire page, right? This one. So we can just go ahead and remove this background for now. So next let's change the UI for the item slots in the inventory. So item slots is inside content, scroll view, and yeah, here you can see the item slot. And it's a prefab, so we can easily, so we only have to edit it once. So from here, first I'll change the background. I'll just use this inventory cell background for the slot. And then we also have to change the background for the slot when it's highlighted and selected. Okay, so in our current UI, this is the highlighted slot and this is the selected slot. In the sci-fi UI, they only have a single highlighted slot. So we can use the same one for both highlighted and selected background. But in most games, you have different background when a slot is highlighted and selected. So try to find different background for them if you want that. Okay, so next we need to fix the image. The image seems to like stick out of the slot. So for that, I'll select the item image and we can try to bring it down by reducing the top field. Okay, something around 13 should be fine. And to make it a squared image, we can set 13 for left, right, and bottom also. Okay, So now the image fits inside the slot. So up next we need to change the font of this count text. So I'll change it to this font called Dune Rise. It's just a font that came with this sci-fi UI asset. Okay, and we also want to reduce the font size. This doesn't look good, so I'll reduce it to something like 18, and that looks much better. Okay, so let me go out of the prefab and see how it looks. So for this inventory UI, it doesn't look good to fill it up with so many slots. So we can try reducing the number of slots we have. So right now we have 49 slots, 7 columns and 7 rows. We can change it to 6 by 6 and make it 36 slots. Okay, so here I don't want to change the size of the inventory UI directly, because if I do that, it won't look good. Instead, I want to reduce the size of its content while not affecting the size of the background. Okay, so I'll go inside the inventory UI, and to reduce the size of the content, we can reduce the size of this scroll view. Okay, we can try to make it a 6 by 6 grid, and I'll try to place this at the center. So yeah, that looks fine. And next we can also change the UI of the scroll bar. So that's inside the scroll bar vertical. So here we can set the background of the scroll bar. So I'll just drag and drop the scroll bar background, which comes with this asset. And we also need to change the handle. For the handle, I'll just make the squared image with a blue color. So I'll remove the source image and I'll just change the color to something like sky blue. Okay. So next let's also change the font of a header and these buttons. So I'll open up the header and here we have the heading. So I'll change the font to this one and I'll make this a lot more smaller. Something like 28 should be enough. And let me also change the icons for the buttons. So we have a few icons here. So let me go ahead and change that. And we need to adjust the position of the header so that it matches with this background. Yeah, something like that should be fine. And by the way, since we changed the number of slots, we also have to change it in the inventory UI script. So here I'll make it 36. And we also have to change the rows and columns in the selection settings. Okay. So here the column is still 7 because I did override this before. So we can actually just revert it from here and it'll change to the column of the prefab. Okay. So yeah, this is how you customize the UI for the inventory. So let's try testing the game and see how it looks from the game view. I'll just disable the inventory container since I don't want it to be active by default. And I'll press I to open up the inventory. And you can see that now we have a sci-fi looking inventory. All right. Obviously the items that we have doesn't fit with the sci-fi theme, but you can go ahead and add items that matches for this theme. Okay. And we also have to change things like this weight UI, this heading, the equipment UI, these instruction texts and all that. But I won't be covering that in this tutorial because it's just the same process and I don't want the tutorial to be too long. Okay, but you can easily change them and you can make it look like a good sci-fi UI, something like this. Okay, so I'm going to revert these changes and I'll go back to our old inventory UI because this UI doesn't match with the items that we have. I just created this because you'll get an idea on how to customize the UI. Okay, so let me go ahead and revert it back. And now we're back with our old inventory UI. So up next, let's look at some settings that we can customize for the inventory. So if you select the inventory canvas game object, here we have a few settings that we can customize. So here we have a setting called show details of selected item. So by default, we'll show the details of the item on which the mouse is hovered on. But if this is set to true, then we'll show the details of the selected item and not the item on which the mouse is hovered on. Okay, so this is especially useful when running the game on consoles where the players don't have a mouse with which they can hover on an item. Okay, so next in the inventory opener script, we have a setting called inventory pauses game. So this determines whether we should pause the game when opening the inventory. All right. So for some games like Dark Souls, the game is not paused when we open the inventory. The game will keep running. So if you're making such a game, then you can turn off the setting called inventory pauses game. So next, from the inventory sound effects script, you can customize the sound effects for different actions in the inventory like consume, equip, unequip, and all that. And if you want to customize the sound of the selection, that is inside the selection UI. So here in the inventory UI, under the selection settings, we have the select clip. So this is the sound effect that will be played when we change selection. So selection settings is something that's common for all selection UI, not just inventory. So that's why we have this as a separate clip over here. Okay. And from here, you can even change things like selection speed. So if you want the selection to be faster, then you can simply increase this. All right. So next, if you want to set up controller input, you can either set it up by specifying buttons in the inventory input manager, or you can also use the new input system. So to use the new input system, you can go to the FS systems window and under dependencies, you can enable the new input system. Okay. And once you enable that, the project will use new input system and you can customize the input for the inventory from third person controller input action folder. So here we have an asset called FS system input action. And from here under the action map, you can just select inventory and you'll be able to see the action for each inventory action. And you can specify a controller input for each one of them. All right. So these are the main settings you can customize for the inventory. So next, let's look at how we can change the equipment slots. So we have few equipment slots by default, but in your game you might need different equipment slots, right? So let's say you want an equipment slot for gloves and boots. We'll look at how to add that. So I'll go inside the inventory canvas and here under the inventory slash equip UI, the inventory is in the left area and the equipment UI is in the right area, right? And below this, inside the content, we have all the equipment slots. Okay, so this is a UI for the equipment slot, but before we add the UI, we actually have to add a slot from the inventory editor, right? So here we have equipment slots, and in here we have to add the additional equipment slots that we want. Okay, so I'll add one for the hand and another for the foot, and once we add it, we'll be able to assign that equipment slot from here. All right, so here let's add an equipment slot for hand and foot. So I'll just use Control D to duplicate the equipment slot of the body, and I'll call this equipment slot hand. Okay, and we also have to change its image. So I'll just search for glove slot. So I'll just assign an image of a glove, and then here we have a script called equipment slot UI. So in here you have to change the slot to hand. Okay, so that's all you have to do to add an extra equipment slot. So let's also add another slot for the foot. So I'll change its name to equipment slot foot, and then from here I'll change the slot to foot, and finally I'll just find another image for it. Okay, you can add any image you want. So now the UI is overflowing a bit, but we can easily fix that by increasing the size of the equipment UI. Okay, and then we can just center it again. So I'll hold Alt and center it from here. Okay, so once we add the slot, we also have to assign it to our equipment slots list, which is in the equipment UI game object. Okay, so here we have all the list of slots that we have. So to this, I'll add the hand slot and the foot slot UI. Okay, let me place hand over here, just like how it is in the UI, and I'll place the foot over here. All right, so this is all we have to do to add a new equipment slot. So to test this, let's add some items which we can equip to our new slots. So I'll open up the inventory editor, and from here I'll add a new item called leather glove. Okay, and I'll make its category armor, and we can also attach a model for it. So I'll attach this gloves model. Okay, and then I'll just give some random values for the price, weight, defense, and all that. And next, let's create boots, which we can equip to our foot slot. Okay, I'll call this leather boots, and I'll change this category to armor. I'll give it an icon, and for the boot, the equipment slot should be foot, and then we can assign a model for the boot. So all these are skinned mesh models. Okay, and finally I'll just give some random values for the weight, price, defense, and all that. So now let's go ahead and add these items to our inventory by default. So I'll add it here. All right, and let me just disable the inventory container by default and run the game. Okay, so now if I open the inventory, we should have the gloves and boots. So let me try assigning it to the equipment slot, and yeah, you can see that it's working. So that's how we can add new equipment slots to the inventory. Okay, and if you want to remove it, you can simply remove it from here and also delete it from the equipment slots list. All right, so yeah, it's pretty easy to add and remove equipment slots. So up next, let's set up merchants and shops. So inside our inventory canvas, we have inventory container and then another UI for shop, crafting, dismantling, and all that. So if I just disable the inventory container, you can see the shop UI, and inside it again you have shop UI, crafting UI, dismantle UI, and all that. So let's look at the shop UI. So here we have an inventory UI in both the left and right area. In the left, it's the inventory UI for the player, and at the right, it's the inventory UI for the merchant, from which we can buy and sell items. Okay, so in the inventory UI script, here at the top, you can see a checkbox called use player inventory. So if that is checked, then it'll use the player's inventory, and otherwise we can use any other inventory like the inventory of a merchant. Okay, so we don't want to hard code this because different merchants can have different inventory. So let's look at how we can set up a merchant first. I'll just disable this UI by default, and I want to set up a merchant, and I only want to open the shop UI when the player goes and talks to that merchant. Okay, so let me switch to the 3D mode, and from here I'll add a merchant. So I'll go inside our fantasy night pack, and I'll add the same character model as the merchant because I don't want to import a separate package just for another character. So let me add a parent game object for it. I'll call it merchant, and let me just reset its position and add the character under it, and I'll change its position. I'll just place him like that, and we can just assign a default animator to it. I'll just use the same animator I used for the player, and we can also add a capsule collider to it so that the player won't be able to go through this character. Okay, I'll just set its height to 2, and I'll just center it like this. And by the way, you don't even have to use a character for the merchant. It can be any other game object like a model of a shop or anything. Okay, so now let's set up this merchant so that he can buy and sell items. So for that, I'll add a script called merchant to it. And when you add the merchant script, it automatically adds an inventory script with it. So that's because the merchant needs an inventory of items that he can sell. Right. So it is the same inventory script that we used for the player. Okay. So here you can add the default items that the merchant can have in his inventory. So let me add some items. I'll add few breastplates and then some helmets and then few swords, and then I can add a potion. So since potions are a stackable item, we can just increase their count if we want the merchant to have multiple potions. Okay, I'll also add another potion. Alright, so next, for the shop, I don't want to show the items as different categories and all that. Usually in games, all the items are shown together in a shop. So I'll just disable this checkbox called store categories separately. If you want to show them as separate categories, you can turn them on, and then you'll also have to specify the category slots and all that. I'll just keep it off. So we also have a few settings in the merchant script. So here we can specify things like whether the merchant can buy and sell items, craft items, dismantle items and all that. So we want to set up the merchant so that when the player goes near the merchant and press the interact button, it'll open the shop UI and the player will be able to buy and sell items. Okay, so to make the merchant an interactable object with which the player can interact, we have to add another script here called merchant hotspot. Okay, so here we have to give an interact UI prefab. So this is just that text that you see about the player, like press E to talk and all that. So there is a default interact UI that comes with the asset. I'll just search for that. I'll search it in the asset, and yeah, this is the one. And interact UI offset is how high above the game object the UI should appear. So since the characters are normally around 1.8 meters, we have to show the UI above that. So next we have to assign a script called shop opener. So that's just a helper script that allows us to open the shop. So it's in the shop UI container over here. So we can just drag and drop it to our merchant. Okay. And then we also have design a reference of the merchant script. So we can directly drag and drop it here. And next, for the hotspot, we also need to add a collider. So the collider spawned in the wrong place. Okay, I think we just moved the character instead of moving the parent game object itself. So we can just copy the component from here and paste it to the merchant parent game object, and then we can reset this value. Okay, so this collider will define the area inside which the player can interact with the merchant. So we need to make it a trigger, and we need to change its size so that it's a bit more bigger. And let me also raise it up a bit. Okay, and finally, for the player to be able to detect this hotspot, we have to change the layer to hotspot. All right, so that is all we have to do. So let's try testing it now. Okay, so if I go near the merchant, you can see that it's showing the interact UI. And now if I press E, it opened the shop, right? So we can try to buy and sell items from the shop. So let's say I want to buy a breastplate. I can select it and press E to buy it. But it's showing that I don't have enough cash. So that is because we haven't set up our wallet yet. So if you go to the player script, here we have a script called wallet that can hold the money that they have. So here we can add a currency, and let's start the player with $100 so that we can use it to buy some items. So let me test again. All right, I'll open up the shop again, and now if I try to buy this breastplate, you can see that it has been added to our inventory. Okay, we can also sell items. So let's say I want to sell this boot. I can just click on it and press E to sell it. And now it's added to the inventory of the merchant. So one thing to note is that the price that we get for selling will be lower than the actual price of the object. Okay, so here the cost of a breastplate is 40, but when we sell it, we'll get only 20. So that is how shops are designed in most games. You won't get the full price for selling an item, and you can define how much you'll get for selling an item by changing the sell price modifier. So right now it's 0.5, so we'll get half the price. So if we change it to 1, you'll get the whole price, and you can set it to any value, and that will modify the price that you get for the item. And next, we can also try buying a stackable item, so that should be added to our potions slot. So I'll click on this and press E, and now since this is a stackable item, we can buy multiple items at a time. So let's say I want to buy 5 potions. I'll change this to 5 and press OK. But we didn't have the cash for that, so let me just try buying 3 items. And yeah, you can see that we bought 3 potions and it got added to our potions slot. Okay, so this is how the shop works. And you can also craft and dismantle items from the merchant if can craft and can dismantle is turned on. But right now we haven't set up crafting and dismantling. We'll be doing that later. Okay, so when I close the shop, the merchant just disappeared. So that is because I missed an important setting. So in the merchant hotspot, there is a setting called disable after interaction. We have to turn it off. Hotspot is like a common script that we use for pickups, merchant and all that. Anything that's interactable. So that's why we have the setting here. For merchant, obviously we have to disable it. Okay, so let's try testing it now. And the merchant should not disappear this time. Okay, you can see that the merchant doesn't disappear after closing the shop. Okay, so up next, let's implement pickups. So here, I'll create a new game object called pickup. Okay, let me reset its position, and let's say we want to create the pickup for this helmet item. So I'll drag and drop helmet over here, and I'll move it somewhere. Okay, and then to the pickup game object, we have to add a script called pickup hotspot. So in this case, we can keep the disable after interaction turned on because we should only be able to pick an item once, right? After that, it should be disabled. And next we can assign the interact UI, just like we did for the merchant hotspot. So let me find it by searching. Okay, and I'll set the offset to 2. And for the item, I'll choose the helmet item. Okay, and to create another pickup item, we can simply duplicate this, and let's say this pickup is for our breastplate. So I'll drag and drop the breastplate in here, and let me remove the helmet, and let me just change its position. All right, and in here we have to change the item to breastplate. I'll actually bring the helmet a bit down. All right, and next for these pickups, we do have to set their layer to hotspot, and we also have to add a box collider that will define the area from which the player can pick up the item. So let me make the box collider bigger, and that should be enough. So yeah, you can duplicate this and create as many pickups as you want. So let's try testing it. So I'll remove the helmet and the breastplate from the player's inventory by default. So the player will have to pick it up. Okay, let me remove the breastplate and helmet. And now let's run the game. So by default in the inventory, we don't have helmet and breastplate, but we should be able to pick it up from here. Okay, if we go close to the item, we'll be able to pick it up. And now it should appear in our inventory. Okay, so it's pretty easy to create pickups. You can simply duplicate these and create as many pickups as you want. All right, so next let's move on to crafting and dismantling. So it's pretty straightforward to set up crafting and dismantling. You can just select an item, and in the crafting tab, you can define the ingredients that can be used to craft that item, and then you can enable the craft and dismantle checkbox. Okay, here we can also define a price for crafting and dismantling items. So let's try to make this leather boot a craftable item. So let's say we can create leather boots from leather scraps. So we can add a new item for leather scraps and use that as an ingredient for the leather boots. Okay, so first I'll create a category for all crafting items. I'll call it crafting items. All right, and crafting items should be stackable, and we can leave everything at default. And now let's create a leather scrap item. Okay, and its category will be crafting item, and we can also give it an icon. All right, and I'll just set the weight as 1 and its price as 2. And now we can use this leather scraps to craft leather boots. So here in the ingredients of the leather boots, I'll assign leather scraps. Okay, and let me just remove the second slot. And let's say we need 3 leather scraps to craft a leather boot. Okay, so while we're here, let's also set up crafting for our sword. So let's say the sword can be crafted by using leather scraps and some iron ingots. So for the first item, I'll add leather scraps, and let's say we just need 2 leather scraps for crafting sword, and then we need an iron ingot. So let me add a new item for that. I'll call it iron ingot. All right, and I'll make its category crafting item, and I'll give it an icon, and I'll just give it a price and a weight. All right, and now to craft our sword, we can use iron ingot as an ingredient, and let's say we need 3 iron ingot. All right, so now I'll select the merchant, and here in the merchant script, we have to add the items that this merchant can craft. Okay, so let's say this merchant can craft sword and leather boots, and I'll also add the leather scraps and iron ingots to the player's inventory by default so that we can use it for crafting. So from here, I'll add 5 leather scraps and 5 iron ingot by default. And we also have to set up a category slot for it since it's a different category. So I'll go ahead and do that. And now when we run the game, we should have the crafting items in our inventory. So let's try to use these items to craft. Okay, so from the shop, I'll click here to go to the crafting window, and we can see the leather boots here, but I don't see the sword. Maybe I missed something. Let me select the sword. Okay, I forgot to add can craft and can dismantle over here. And let's try testing it again. And now I should also see the sword in the crafting window. All right. So sword needs 2 leather scraps and 3 iron ingot, and the leather boots need 3 leather scraps. So we can craft them by pressing the E key. All right. So I've crafted a sword, and it should be added to our inventory. Okay. And next, let me also try crafting a leather boot. All right. And that should also be added to our inventory. So now I won't be able to craft these items anymore because I don't have the required items. So if I try to craft again, I'll get this error. Okay. So next we can also try to dismantle these items. So from the dismantle tab, I can just select an item and press E, and it'll be dismantled. So yeah, it's pretty simple to craft and dismantle items. So next, let's look at how we can save the items in the inventory. So this asset comes with a simple saving system that you can use to save the inventory. So to use the saving system, first you have to attach the saving system script to any one of the objects in your scene. So I'll just attach it to this FS player game object. So the script is called saving system. And then we have to mark all the game objects that the saving system needs to save. Okay, so here we want to save our inventory, right? So we have an inventory on our player, and then we have an inventory on our merchant. So we need to mark these objects as savable. And to do that, all you have to do is attach a script called savable object to the game objects that you want to save. So I attach it to the player game object. Next, let me attach it to the merchant. All right. And now, if we just call a function in the saving system, this function called save, it'll save the game. And then if we call load, it'll load the game. So I have included a sample UI that calls these functions from the saving system. So let's attach the UI and test. So I'll search for main canvas, and this is the UI. I'll put it under my FS player. And now if you run the game, and if I press escape, it should open a small menu like this, and this will allow us to save and load our game. Okay, I can press escape again to close this menu. It's just a test UI that I included for saving and loading. So let's test saving. So what I'll do is I'll open up the inventory and I'll equip some items. All right, and now I'll go ahead and save the game. Okay, we can press the enter or E key to save the game. And now if I restart and if I load the game, you can see that it loaded with the items that I equipped. Right. We can also check the inventory and you can see that the items were equipped here. All right. So our inventory is being saved correctly. Up next, we also want to save this pickups. So to save a pickup, we can't just assign the savable object to it directly, because when we take the pickup, this game object will be disabled, right? So the saving system will not save disabled objects, so we can't directly mark this as savable. Instead, what I'll do is I'll create an empty game object called savable objects, and to this I'll attach another game object called object state saver. So the script will save the active and inactive states of game objects, and then I'll also mark it as savable by attaching the savable object script. Okay, so I'll just make these two pickups a child of our savable objects, and I'll add them to the object to save list, and that's all we have to do to save the pickups. Okay, so remember, if your objects will be disabled like the pickups, then you can directly mark it as savable. You'll have to do it from a parent game object. Okay, so let's try testing this. So I'll go ahead and pick up one of the objects from here. Let me just pick up this breastplate and I'll also equip it. All right, and now I'll save the game. And now if we just restart the game and try to load it, you can see that the breastplate no longer appears as a pickup. So that means it was saved correctly. All right. So yeah, this is all we have to do to save and load our inventory. So next, let's look at how to add actions to item. So if you take a category of an item, you can see that here we can assign an action. So as the name suggests, an action allows you to perform some action when an item is consumed, equipped, or unequipped. Okay, so let's say you want to restore the HP of the player when he consumes a potion. To do that, we can assign an action to our potion category, and all the items under the potion category will use that action. Okay, so our controller comes with some pre-built actions based on the modules that you have installed. But if you're not using our controller, you can define custom actions to specify what should happen when an item is used. So first, let's try using our built-in action called health potion action. So if we consume any of the potions, it should heal the player based on the heal amount of that potion. Okay, so to test that, we actually need to see the HP of the player. So we do have an HP bar UI that can be used to show the HP of our controller. So it's inside third person controller, game, and UI folder. So here we have two HP bars. One is an involved HP bar and the other is a normal HP bar. So I'll add this HP bar to our inventory canvas so that we can use it to see the health of a character. So let me double click on it to focus, and I'll just turn it to 2D. So I'll assign this HP bar above the inventory container so that when we open the inventory UI, it'll be shown over the HP bar. Okay, so in the HP bar, we have to assign a component called damageable. It's called damageable because an HP bar can be used for any damageable objects, not just a player or an enemy. So we have to drag and drop the player over here since we want to show the HP of the player. And to test the working of potions, we should be able to reduce the HP first, right? So since we don't have the combat module installed, we don't have a way to reduce the potion. So what I'll do is I'll just add a test script called damage tester. So all the script does is if the T key is pressed, it'll reduce the health by 5. Okay, so let's try testing it. So if I press the T key, my health should reduce by 5. And now if we try to use a potion, our health should restore by the heal amount. So for this potion it's 30 and for this one it's 50. Let me try using a normal potion and the health should restore by 30. Right now it's 55. So let me try using it. Alright, I consumed the potion and now you can see that the health has been restored by 30 and it's 85 now. Okay, so let's look at how this action for restoring HP is implemented. So I'll search for the health potion action script. So this is the script responsible for creating the action for restoring the HP. So you can see that it inherits from another script called item action. So all item actions should inherit from this script, and inside the script you can see all the methods that we can override. So these methods will be called when an item is used or equipped or unequipped, and we also have methods to check if an item can be used and all that. So you can write custom code whenever any of these events happen. Okay, so if we go back to our health potion action, I've override the on use function. So this function will be called when an item is consumed, and we'll get the item that is consumed and the character on which the item is consumed. So from the item, I fetched the heal amount attribute by calling get attribute value function. So if we look at our potion, you can see that we have an attribute called heal amount and it's an integer, and each item that's a potion will have a value for that attribute, right? So I'm getting the value of the heal amount attribute from here, and then I'm getting the damageable component of my character so that I can update its health. Okay, so this is how I'm updating the health of our character controller. But in your case, the logic after fetching the HP amount will be different, right? Your character might have its HP stored in a different way, so you'll have to change the code accordingly. So let's look at how to add an action from scratch so that you'll get the full picture of how to implement custom actions. Okay, so for creating an action, first we have to create a script that inherits from item action. So I'll just go ahead and create a script over here. I'll create a mono behavior script and I'll call this custom potion action. Let me just open up the action in Visual Studio and I'll just get rid of the default code, and I'll make this action inherit from our item action class. Okay, we might have to import the inventory namespace, so I can do that by pressing Control and dot. This is the namespace that we have to import. Okay, and from here we can override any of these functions. So in our case, since we are making an action for a potion, I'll override the onUse function. So yeah, this is a function that will be called when an item is consumed, right? And from this function, you can write any logic that you want. So let's say first I want to fetch the heal amount of the item. So I'll call item dot get attribute value. And we know that this attribute is an integer and its name is heal amount. Okay, I'll just store this in a variable called heal amount. And then we can use it to restore the HP of our character. So this is a code that will be different for your controller. Okay, so for now I'll just log some message saying something like the HP was restored by this amount. And let's try testing this custom potion action. So to test this, first we have to assign it to our potion category. So from here, I'll change this action and you can see that a custom potion action appears over here now. So all the classes that inherit from the item action class will appear in this UI. Okay, so we have changed the potion action, and now when we test, this should be printed. So let me try testing it. I'll go to the inventory and I'll try to consume a potion. Okay, so you can see this message here saying that the HP was restored by 30. Ignore these errors, they're just Unity editor errors. Alright, and if I try to consume this potion, oh, I just equipped it. If I try to consume it, you can see that now the HP was restored by 50 was printed. Okay, so this is how we create custom action and integrate the inventory system with any custom control. Alright, so up next, let's look at how to integrate the inventory system with the FS melee combat system so that we can use the inventory and combat together. So to this project, I've also imported the melee combat system asset. So right now, our player does not have any combat scripts attached to him. So what I'll do is I'll just disable this player and I'll go ahead and create a new player who has both inventory and combat. So from here, I'll check both inventory and melee combat system. And for the model, we can just choose the character model that we used before. And I'll click setup. Okay, so that should create the player. And this player should have both inventory and combat scripts. But the inventory, wallet and all that are empty right now. For wallet, I'll just add a $100 by default. And for the inventory, let me just copy the values from our old player so that we don't have to fill it all over again. So I'll find the inventory script from here and I'll copy its values and then paste it over here. Okay, and we also have to set up the item attacher script. So for this, I'll just set the spine to bone as the melee weapon holder. All right, so now we should have a player with both inventory and combat system. So if I test, I should be able to perform the default attacks, and I also should be able to pick up items and equip armor and all that. Okay, so let me also add an enemy character so that I can test the actual combat. So to add the enemy character, I'll go to Tools, Combat System, and I'll open up the Create Character window. And for the character model, I'll again use the same model, and I'll check this enemy checkbox because we are creating an enemy, and then I'll hit on create character. All right, let me just place the enemy somewhere over here. And we also need to define an ab mesh so that our enemy will be able to move. So in our plane, I'll create an ab mesh surface component and I'll just bake it. Okay, so this is our enemy, and the enemy should have the combat scripts like melee fighter, enemy controller, and all that. So from here, let me actually increase the health of the enemy so that we can test things properly and the enemy won't die with just a few hits. And next, let me also add health bar to the player and the enemy. So for the player, we can add an on-screen health bar. So the health bar is inside third-person controller, game UI folder. So from here, I'll add the normal health bar onto our inventory canvas. Okay, and I'll assign the player as the damageable item of the HP bar. And then let me also add an HP bar for the enemy. For the enemy, I'll use the HP bar world because I don't want the enemy's HP bar on the screen. Okay, and let me also assign the enemy to the damageable field. So let's try testing this now. So let me try to use combat and inventory together. So I'll just pick up these items and I'll try to fight the enemy. So by default, you can see that the damage inflicted from a kick is 10. Okay, so if I equip some armor, then the damage inflicted should be lesser than that. So now you can see that the damage inflicted is 6. Previously, when no armor was equipped, the damage was 10, but now the damage is reduced to 6 due to the armors. The damage reduction will be based on the defense stat of all the armor equipped. We'll look at how we can modify the damage calculation later. Next, if you try equipping a sword, it will be equipped to the back of the player. But right now, we won't be able to perform any attacks with these swords. So the reason for that is because the sword that we created from the inventory is just a normal item. It's not a weapon that was created from the combat system, right? So you won't be able to create weapons directly from the inventory editor. Instead, you'll have to create it from the combat system. All right. So I can just go to create, and here under the combat system, I can create a new weapon. Okay. Let me just call this something like steel sword. So this is how we create weapons in the combat system, right? So here we can see that we have some common fields that we have in the inventory, like the name, icon, prefab, the damage attribute, and all that. And if you open a inventory editor, you'll have this same item in the inventory editor. Let me just make this a bit smaller. And if I just search for steel sword in here, you can see that the steel sword that we created appears in our inventory editor. All right. So when we create a weapon from the combat system, it'll be a special type of item with melee weapon as its category. Okay. So this is a predefined category in the combat system. And then you can either change the details like name, icon, damage, and all that from the scriptable object of the weapon or from here. Okay. So for example, if I change the name to steel sword, it should also change over here because these two items are the same, right? So I could also change the icon from here. I'll just give it a sword icon. All right. And you can see that it changed here. So the integration between the combat and the inventory system is pretty much built in. You don't have to do any extra steps to integrate them. You just have to create a weapon in the combat system like you would normally do, and then you'll be able to see it in the inventory system. And from here, we can set up things like price, crafting, and all that. Okay. The only thing, never change the category of a weapon from here. If you change it to something else, then this will not be considered as a weapon by the combat system. All right. So from here, we can fill in all the base details. We can give it a prefab, and we can give it a damage value. Note that the values also change from here. And then we have equipment configuration of a weapon. So here we have a checkbox called attach on body. So if I check that, you can see that it is the same attach model checkbox that we have over here. Okay, it is the same property. So for a combat weapon, there are two ways in which we can attach it. So we can attach it somewhere on the body when that weapon is not actually equipped, right? And when the weapon is equipped, it should be attached to the player's hand so that he'll be able to perform attacks with it. Okay, so combat weapon can be attached to the body and also to the hand of the player. But since attaching to the hand is specific to a combat weapon, it won't be shown in our inventory editor. It has to be edited from here itself. So in here, we can set a local position and local rotation for how the sword should be attached to the body. We have already done that for the old sword that we created. We can simply copy its value and paste it for our new sword. Okay, and similarly, you'll have to find the values for how the sword should be attached to the player's hand and paste it over here. All right, so this was already covered in the tutorial for the combat system. So in our melee weapon, there are some fields that are also common in our inventory editor, but there are also lots of extra fields like attacks, counters, and all that, which the inventory system is not concerned about. So I have covered all these things like setting up attacks, blocks, counters, and all that in the dedicated tutorial for the combat system. So I'm not going to cover this again in this video. So what I'm going to do is I'll just delete this item and I'll just use a sword that I created before to save time. All right, this is a sword. So here I have filled in all these values like general settings, equipment configurations, and I also set up attacks and all that. You can also view this weapon from the inventory editor. Just search for OH sword. All right. So for this weapon, inventory specific details like pricing, crafting, and all that can be set from here. And combat specific details like attacks, blocking, counter, and all that can be set from here. Okay. So I have already set this up. So I'll add this weapon to the player's inventory by default. Okay. So instead of our old rusty sword, I'll assign this sword. And note that the items that are combat weapon will have this icon. Okay. And in the category slots, we do have to change the weapon category that we created and replace it with the melee weapon, which is the category that comes with the combat system by default. And I'll just leave this old axe because it belongs to the old category that we created. And now let's try testing this. So let me try to fight the enemy. So by default, the damage inflicted to the enemy is 10 when I kick him. But if we equip a sword, we should be able to inflict a lot more damage. So we can press the 1 key to equip the sword from a bag. So now let me try to attack the enemy with my sword. So you can see that the sword inflicts a lot more damage and we were able to kill the enemy with just a few hits. The damage of a weapon will be based on its damage stat. So for the sword, the damage stat is 30, so it will inflict a lot of damage. So let's look at how the damage calculation works. And it will also give you an idea on how to modify the damage calculation to suit your own games. So the damage calculation is in a script called damage calculator. So I'll just search for that. And here you can see the script called damage calculator. So I'll open this up in Visual Studio, and this function called calculate damage is the function responsible for calculating the damage. Okay, so if you want to make any modification to the damage calculation formula, then you can do it from here. So here for the damage, first we are adding the weapon damage and the attack damage. So the weapon damage is the base damage of the weapon, and the attack damage can be used to increase that. So for example, for strong attacks, you can give a bit more damage than normal attacks. And by the way, in some games, the weapon damage and attack damage are not added, they are multiplied. So if you want, you can change that from here. Okay. So after finding the damage from the weapon and attack damage, we reduce the damage based on the defense of the character that received the attack. So defense is just a sum of the defense stat of all the armor a character is wearing. So here you have two functions to calculate defense: apply defense reduction direct and apply defense reduction percentage. So in direct, we'll directly reduce the defense from the damage while clamping it to a maximum limit. But in percentage, we'll just reduce the percentage of damage based on the defense stat. So these types of calculations are mostly used in RPG games, while these types of simple calculations are used in games with simple combat systems. So yeah, you can modify the damage calculation from here, and you can write your own formula for calculating the damage if you want. All right. So yeah, this is how you use combat and inventory together. I'm just showing a very simplified example here, but you can create lots of different armors and weapons with different stats and all that, and try to make your combat a lot more interesting. So we have covered all the important features of the inventory system. So I'll stop the video here. If you have any further questions about the asset, feel free to ask on our Discord server. So thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.